Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about some nuclear war that almost killed us all. Let's begin. How fun. Despite a reduction in global nuclear tensions and major nuclear reductions after the end of the Cold War in 1992, US and Russia have 90% of the total of 15,000 warheads. Exciting, I know. November 5th of 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the North American Aerospace Defense Command received a number of simultaneous reports. A downed British medium bomber and an unexpected maneuver by the Soviet Black Sea fleet. The perceived threat was due to a combination of events, including a wedge of swans over Turkey, a fighter escort for the Syrian president returning to Moscow, and a British bomber brought down by mechanical issues and scheduled for exercises over the Soviet fleet. In 1958, U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter characterized the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis as the first nuclear crisis. In the conflict, the PRC shelled the islands of Kinmen, coast of mainland China, to liberate Taiwan from the Chinese Nationalist Party. A naval battle also took place around Dojin Islands when the ROC Navy repelled an attempt landing by the PRC Navy. The 1958 Mars Bluff B-47 nuclear weapon loss incident was the release of a nuclear weapon from a U.S. Air Force B-47 bomber over Mars Bluff, South Carolina. The bomb, which lacked the fissile nuclear core, fell over the area, causing damage to buildings below. Though there was no nuclear detonation, 6 people were injured in the explosion. October 5th of 1960, radar equipment in Greenland mistakenly thought that a moonrise over Norway as a large-scale Soviet missile launch. Smart, sort of like NASA. Upon receiving a report of the supposed attack, NORAD went on high alert. However, doubts about the authenticity of the attack was because the Soviet leader was in New York City and head of the USSR United Delegations. On January 24th of 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 4-megaton nuclear bombs broke up in mid-air near North Carolina, dropping its nuclear payload in the progress. The pilot in command ordered the crew to eject at 9,000 feet. 5 crewmen successfully landed safely. 2 others died, unfortunately. The U.S. in a major catastrophe said it seemed credible that a short circuit during a mid-air breakup in the aircraft could have resulted in a nuclear explosion. November 24th of 1961, staff at the Strategic Air Command headquarters simultaneously lost contact with NORAD and multi-ballistic early warning system sites. The communication failure was interrupted as either a very unlikely coincidence or coordinated attacks. SAC headquarters prepared an entire fleet for takeoff before already overhead aircraft confirmed that there did not appear to be an attack. October 1962, 25th of that month, at Folkfield in Wisconsin, a faulty alarm system caused a klaxon sound instead, which already Air Defense Command nuclear-armed F-106A into the air. The pilots had been told that there is no practice alert drills. Before the planes were able to take off, the base command learned of the error. An officer in the command center drove his car onto the runway, flashing his lights and signaling the aircraft to stop. Smart thinking. October 27th of 1962, during the Cuban Missiles Crisis, a group of 11 U.S. Navy destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph located the diesel-powered nuclear-armed Foxtrot-class submarine B-59 near Cuba. Despite being in international waters, the U.S. Navy started dropping signal depth charges, which were intended to force the submarine to come to the surface for identification. Unknowingly, the sub was armed with nuclear weapons. October 28th of 1962, before dawn, a mistaken order was issued by Air Base in Okinawa. Nuclear missile sites were based on to launch all the missiles, which were nuclear, of course. None were launched, thankfully. A team responsible for 4 missiles at Bolo Airfield in Yamatan reported that the order codes were in order, but the local officer in charge did not trust the order. Partly because one of the 4 missiles was targeted for Russia, and he was no logic why missiles would be launched against China. October 27th of 1962, the tensions between the two sides had spiked to the point where U.S. warships began dropping explosives on Soviet submarine B-59. The U.S. Navy tried to force the submarine to rise to the surface, but they were not aware of the fact that the B-59 was laced with a nuclear-tipped torpedo, with roughly the power to destroy Hiroshima. There were 4 Soviet submarines carrying the same bomb, and the commander of each was empowered to act as if without getting direct orders from Moscow in case of a threat. They failed to keep themselves up to date with the latest developments, as some tactical issues resulted in a lack of communications with Moscow. With U.S. forces dropping depth charges, the B-59 crew faced a new wave of explosions. It was then that Valentin Savage surmised with the nuclear war had already started between his country and the U.S. He ordered the firing of the B-59 biggest weapon, the 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, to target giant aircraft carrier, the USS Randolph, which was leading the U.S. task force. However, as per the procedure of the Soviet Army, such as an attack take place on approval, the 3 senior submarine officers would need to say something. It was precisely at this moment that the Soviet officer Vasily Aksanov's disagreement with the commander. While explaining his reasoning, he argued that the submarine was not in danger, saying the U.S. Navy was trying to figure out who they were and what they were doing. November 9th of 1965, the command center of the Office of Emergency Planning went on full alert after the massive power outage in northeastern U.S. Several nuclear bomb detectors used to distinguish between regular power outages and power outages caused by nuclear blast near major U.S. cities malfunctioned due to a circuit error, creating the illusion of a nuclear attack. May 23rd of 1967, a powerful solar flare accompanied by a colossal mass ejection interfered with multiple NORAD radars over the northeastern hemisphere. These radars included 3 ballistic early warning signs that had been upgraded and only resumed operation 8 days prior to the flare. These interferences were intentionally interpreted as jamming of the radars by the Soviets, thus an act of war. April 15th of 1969. After 1969 EC-121 shoot-down incident, F-4 Phantom fighter jets at Kuzhin Air Base was ordered to load B-61 nuclear bombs and began planning and preparations for a nuclear strike. The strike was to include the aircraft from which the North Koreans had attacked EC-121. After a few hours, the order to stand down was given. The jets were never taken off. Reportedly, President Richard Nixon was drunk when he gave this order. Sounds fun. October of 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israel officials panicked that the Arab invasion force was overrun. During the Yom Kippur War, Israeli officials panicked that the Arab invasion force would be overrun by Israel. The U.S. discovered Israel's nuclear deployment after a Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, whose Renaissance aircraft spotted the missiles, and it began an airlift the same day. Israel also redeployed its nuclear weapons. While DEFCON 3 was still in effect, mechanics repairing the alarm system at the Air Force Base in Michigan reported accidentally activated it and nearly scrambled the B-52 bombers at the base before the duty officer declared a false alarm. The crisis finally ended when Prime Minister Meir halted all military action. Declassified Israeli documentations have not confirmed these allegations directly, but have confirmed that Israel was willing to use drastic means to win the war. So, nuclear weapons, of course. November 9th of 1979, computer errors at the NORAD headquarters in Peterson Air Base. NORAD notified National Security Advisor that the Soviet Union had launched 250 ballistic missiles with a trajectory for the U.S., stating that a decision to retaliate would need to be made by the president within 3 to 7 minutes. NORAD computers then placed the number of incoming missiles at 2,220. Strategic Air Command was notified, and they were preparing for takeoff. Within 6 to 7 minutes of the response, PAVE-PAWS satellite and radar systems were able to confirm that the attacks were a false alarm. Commenting on the incident, the U.S. Secretary of Department said that false alarms were that kind are not rare occurrence. Thankfully, that makes us feel good. In the months following the incident, there were 3 more false alarms at NORAD. 2 of them caused by faulty computer chips. One of them forced National Emergency Airborne Command post to taxi into position at an airbase in Andrews. March 15th of 1980, a Soviet submarine near the Kurila Islands launched 4 missiles as part of a training exercise. One of these 4 American early warning sensors suggested one to be aimed towards the U.S. In response, the U.S. convened officials for a threat assessment conference, at which point it was determined not to be a threat and the situation was resolved. Going through this whole list of all the nuclear weapons that could have gone off, it is quite scary. I'm mostly reading towards the US and surrounding areas, but think about all in the world of all the nuclear weapons and all the stuff that could have gone wrong. It's quite fun to have a good day where you wake up. September 18th to the 19th, one of those days in 1980, the Damocles Titan missile explosion, also called the Damocles accident, was a 1980 U.S. nuclear weapons incident involving a Titan II ballistic missile. The incident occurred on September 18th or 19th, 1980, at Missile Complex 3747 in rural Arkansas when a U.S. Air Force Titan II loaded with a 9 megaton nuclear warhead experienced a liquid fuel explosion inside its silo. The incident began with a fuel leak at 6:30 p.m. on September 18th and accumulated with the explosion at around 3 a.m. on September 19th, ejecting the warhead from its silo. The warhead landed a short distance away and no radioactive material was lost. Quite fun. On September 26th of 1983, 3 weeks after the Soviet military had shot down the Korean Airlines Flight 007, a duty officer at the command center for the Aqua nuclear early warning system when the system reported that a missile had been launched from the U.S., followed by up to 5 more. Officer judged the reports were false alarm. Later, it was apparent that he was right. No missiles were approaching. November 7th to 11th of 1983, Able Archer 83 was a command post exercise carried by the NATO military forces. NATO then began simultaneously preparing for the transition to nuclear war. These simulations included 170 radio silent flights to airlift 19,000 U.S. troops to Europe, regularly shifting military commands to avoid nuclear attacks. The issue was worsened by leaders referring to B-52 as nuclear strikes by the increased use of encrypted diplomatic channel. The issue was worsened by leaders referring to B-52 as nuclear strikes by the increased use of encrypted channels between the US and UK, and by the nuclear attack false alarm in September. In response, Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft was fueled and armed, ready to launch on the runway with nuclear weapons. The exercise was a ruse to cover NATO preparations for a nuclear first strike, and Frantic sent a telegram. Soviet leaders believed the exercise was a ruse, and frantically sent a telegram to seeking information on NATO preparations for an attack. In 1991, during the Persian Gulf War, Iraq launched Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia, and Israel possessed a large cache of weapons of mass destruction. This, along with Saddam Hussein's previous threats to burn half of Israel with chemical weapons, led to fears that Saddam Hussein would order the use of chemical weapons against the US-led coalition or against Israel. At the same time, US Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney emphasized that the US WMD against coalition forces would lead to a nuclear attack on Iraq. Nevertheless, Saddam Hussein did have a plan to launch armed warheads at Tel Aviv in the event that he became cut off from the Iraq armed forces, leadership, or if the Iraq government was about to collapse, which was almost certain after he triggered a retaliation nuclear response from Israel. Saddam ultimately never deemed that option necessary because he never felt as if the government had to collapse. In 1995, Russian President Boris Yeltsin became the first world leader to activate the Russian nuclear briefcase after Russia radar systems detected the launch of what was later determined to be a Norwegian Black Brant X-11 research rocket being used to study the Northern Lights. Science is fun. Russian ballistic missile submarines were put on alert in preparation for a possible retaliation strike. It became clear that the rocket did not pose a threat to Russia and it was not part of a larger attack. The alarm was canceled. Russia was in fact one of the number one countries early informed of the launch. However, the information had not reached the Russian radar operations. Thank you for coming on this journey of nuclear disasters that almost happened. This was mostly US intention, but I'm sure other countries had a lot of other cases where they almost dropped a nuclear weapon or they dropped nuclear weapons and it blew up, but it didn't fizzle or whatnot. So thankfully we're all still here. Your thoughts on the dilemma? Should we have nuclear weapons? Should there be more nuclear weapons? Thank you and have a great day. Bye.